boredom, amused. And I have chosen you to feel, to preach this adventure.
Why me?
Because you're on television, dummy. 60 million people watch you every night of the week, Monday through Friday.
I have seen the face of God.
You just might be right, Mr. Just might be right, Mr.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, all aboard the Psychonautilus. Voyage the 25th, and about bloody time too. Thank you for joining me anyway. Tonight's subject will be the plasma universe. So, in a nod to listener preferences as dictated by my website statistics, I'll be attempting to try and fill out some of the in my electrobiology stuff. I'm often loosely referring to things like cold plasma, ions, cations, fields, and in the holographic reality stuff, I've tied in the sort of laws of electromagnetism to the potential rule set that dictates the nature of the shape of reality as we experience it. Now, with plasma, I'm going into an entirely different bloody realm. I honestly thought that I had a reasonable grasp on plasma until I actually started to study it to any reasonable degree. I grew up more or less kind of welding in my nappies. I've been a welder sort of most of my adult life, and have had cause to work with some real exotica in metal cutting trade, in the metal bashing industry, from the common or garden sort of 80-100 amp stick arc welder that many people are familiar with, to huge industrial three-phase MIG welders and TIG welders. TIG welders are really interesting creations, basically using pulsed energy rather than a directional current to achieve the same results as you can achieve with a flame, and with some extraordinary metal binding properties. With certain settings on a TIG welder, you can weld dissimilar metals without a welding medium in between. So you could weld, say, steel to brass, and the welded joint will be an amalgam of steel and brass, and just phenomenal possibilities with that. But in my early teens, in fact my first job out of school, I was working at a steel stockholders with these contraptions called plasma cutters. I believe they were fairly recent developments to the sort of metal bashing trade in the 80s. Prior to that date, everything was basically plate bed guided gas cutting axes, so essentially oxyacetylene type torches hung on a gantry over a workpiece and slowly kind of automatically fed through the piece. These plasma cutters replaced that oxyacetylene flame with a confined high energy plasma, which would generate such intense temperatures when it came into contact with the workpiece that this thing, the biggest one, was capable of slicing straight through, and I mean straight through, 6-inch thick plate stainless steel. And it would literally be like a hot knife through butter. If you can imagine drawing a hot knife through a cold piece of butter, that was the sort of speed that this thing would slice through 6 inches of steel. I've never seen anything quite like it in my life. and because of the way that the plasma was what's known as heterodyned, was carried on a parallel stream of high pressure air within an excluded inert gas sort of environment, that this thing was effectively like a laser and would cut more or less a parallel slice straight through 6 inches of stainless steel. It never ceases to amaze me even to this day. Consequently, with my sort of knowledge of electronics, of lighting, and my kind of affinity with fire, I thought that I really had a pretty good grasp on what this plasma thing was, until I actually started looking into the physics of it, and because of that, tonight I reserve the right to be very, very wrong. If I say something and you're listening to this and you know something about the subject and you go, oh my God, that's just completely wrong and everything else falls apart because of it, please, 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 please don't just shout at the radio, shout at the podcast, shout at YouTube, whatever. Please drop me a comment on freemanjack.net in the comments box. I'll always respond to comments. I can't encourage you enough to participate through my comment section. It can be a valuable resource for material that I haven't come across, so it doesn't necessarily have to be a correction or a criticism. It can be to augment the subject. But I'm delighted to have anybody criticise my work. It's through criticism that we're able to refine how we conceive of a subject. So I try and express the importance of this. Essentially, the model that I'm arriving at through my studying of the Electric Universe stuff that the lads are putting out through the Thunderbolts project, and their sort of amassed array of scientists now that are getting behind them. Their sort of sister group, the Sapphire Project, definitely one to YouTube if you've not come across the Sapphire Project yet and you have any interest in plasma physics or cosmology. Essentially, the Sapphire Project is attempting to reproduce cosmological plasma effects in the laboratory, possibly for the first time, or certainly for the first time, with a mind to exploring the far reaches of the universe in the laboratory, with some incredibly interesting results already. And in my electrobiology work as well, I began to hypothesize that the morphology of plants, that the shape that we see plants exhibiting, is not merely a reflection of the plant trying to collect light in the most efficient way that it can, or trying to project its sex parts, its flowers, into the most beneficial situation. Because if that was the case, then every flowering plant and every leafed plant would have an identical morphology. However, we don't see that. We see a huge variation between plant shapes, plant sizes, leaf sizes, all sorts of different ratios being expressed. And most of these differing types of plant come from differing natural environments, and will thrive mostly in the type of environment that they have come from. And it would be my suggestion that the reason for this is not simply because of the rough soil type, sandy, dry, wet, whatever, that it's more to do with the electrostatic properties of those soil types and how those electrostatic properties are best exploited by the plants, and not only by the plants but by their sistering plants. So this is a synthesis of exploitation of an electrical field that exists everywhere. And this is what I want to try and impress on you tonight, is that we are sitting on a huge anode. I will possibly go into anode and cathode a little bit later in some more detail, because again, I actually thought I was going to have to offer a complete correction and a complete sort of Uncle Stumblefuckery warning, when I thought a few weeks ago that I had actually completely confused my use of anode and cathode in all of my work. Rewardingly, having looked a little bit closer, I find that my use of anode and cathode was probably entirely appropriate, but I have actually found a little factual website that does a wonderful job of explaining some of the sort of difficulties when throwing around terms like anode and cathode, generally used to describe the positive and negative terminals on an electrical circuit. Seeing as I don't have the sort of academic training that many of the sort of scientists in the field will obviously have over and above me, I feel that I'm going to have to rely quite heavily on external material. Of course, as usual, Thunderbolts Project comes to the rescue. Again, another one of these situations where the very first publication that I did on People's Internet Radio of my electrobiology hypothesis, and then the subsequent video that I did, the subsequent show that I did with Doc Rock, that has become a hugely popular video on my website, the Electric Everything Theory video. Where was I going with that? Oh yeah, essentially keep preceding Thunderbolts Project releases. And so I'm sort of occupying this peculiar realm of relying on a material resource to base a lot of my work on, because they appear to be the only group that are working in the same sort of fields that I need to study, and are very good at putting the subjects into common enough language and visual enough representations that I'm able to understand it, and I'm happy to, you know what I mean, to kind of share that with others. So yeah, what tends to happen is I'll be discussing something, whether it be electrometeorology or electrogravitics, planetary formation, cosmology, plasma suns, etc. And a few months after I've gone to air with this and could have done with more information, so the bloody Thunderbolts Project boys will release a video on that particular subject, and I either get to find out whether I was right or wrong, and call it confirmation bias or whatever you like. Fortunately, with the Thunderbolts Project, I find that the vast majority of everything that they're putting out seems to be reflecting an identical set of realizations about the world around us. And so in that vein, I'm going to be relying on them quite heavily tonight, so I expect quite a bit of Thunderbolts Project. And to kick things off, to try and explain why this is important, that cold plasma, if we live on an anode, if the planet is a huge anode in a cathode space, there is a field that exists, an electric field that exists all the time. And this electric field is of magnitude orders that when it is short-circuited, let's say, the short-circuit event is of such power that it can't cease to fire the imaginations of men's minds. The amount of force in a lightning bolt is inconceivable, let alone the amount of energy coming out of something like a sun. And so I want to try and express on you that we living on the surface of the Earth, we are effectively living in a high voltage plasma environment, but because we are not because we're not short circuiting that, because we are effectively a neutrally charged body sitting midway between the charges, the only time that we experience that incredible high energy is if we unfortunately become the conduit for that short circuit. You know what I mean? If we get hit by a lightning bolt or something. So I'm trying to impress on you that we live in an invisible environment of cold plasma, of non-current bearing plasmas. And so this one hopefully will do a lot to illustrate that. This is Space News by the Thunderbolts Project, and this one's called Nature's Electrode.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. On planet Earth, the most obvious and dramatic display of electricity in nature is lightning. But what causes lightning? Although there currently is a consensus opinion about the processes that produce lightning in clouds on Earth, most scientists freely admit that many mysteries remain. On this series, we have discussed several discoveries that add to the mysteries, including the finding that solar storms cause increased lightning on Earth, and the ongoing puzzle of lightning that occurs above thunderclouds, reaching towards space. In this episode, Thunderbolt's colleague Andrew Hall explores the evidence that lightning is a product of the electromagnetic circuitry connecting the Earth and the Sun.
The following image is from NOAA and illustrates the consensus theory of lightning genesis. As you can see, it shows electrons collecting like marbles in a sink, accelerating down a slippery slope into what looks like a drain. A typical cloud-to-ground lightning needs 1 billion trillion electrons. Are electrons just randomly floating in the clouds when suddenly 1 billion trillion of them jump into an imaginary drain pipe like this image portrays? The consensus notion is that charge builds in thunderstorms because of static electricity. The friction of hailstones and rain colliding in the storm generates static charge, like rubbing a balloon against hair or shuffling feet on carpet. Positive and negative charged particles from this friction separate into layers according to the consensus notion. The layers where they are found pooling are at distinct thermal boundaries. So it's thought these thermal boundary layers keep the pools of charge apart, except when they arc. The situation is depicted in this NOAA image of a supercell, where layers of charge are shown stratified inside the cloud. To become coherent, stratified, and able to build enough charge for a 5-mile-long lightning bolt, 1 billion trillion electrons worth, the charge density required implies a plasma is involved. In fact, it's more than an implication. How else could so much charge collect to create such arcs? There's no wire in the sky, no battery terminal or electrode to generate an arc. These pools of charge must be plasmas. It only takes 1% of neutral air to be ionized for it to behave as a plasma. Lightning genesis requires a plasma because that is what forms the electrode in the sky. Let's consider lightning and how, why, and where plasma forms to play a role in making it. We know Earth's atmosphere is an electric circuit. It carries charge, current, and voltage. The air is a weak conductor with a variable vertical current between the ground and ionosphere of 1 to 3 picoamps per square meter. The resistance of the atmosphere is 200 ohms. The clear sky voltage potential averages 200 to 400,000 volts between Earth and the upper atmosphere. At any given moment, there are about 2,000 lightning storms occurring worldwide. To create lightning, the electric field potential must overcome the dielectric breakdown of air at 3 million volts per meter. It does so because the electric field in a thunderstorm jumps to over 300 million volts. A typical lightning bolt is 3 to 5 miles long and momentarily delivers about 30,000 amps to ground. The collective current from a typical storm delivers from 1/2 to 1 amp. The circuit is completed, a worldwide current from earth to sky, and storms that return it from sky to ground. The 2,000 concurrent lightning storms, each about 1.5 amps, means this worldwide current is about 3,000 amps. Only that isn't the whole story, because there is much more science doesn't know about Earth's circuitry. There is also an exchange from atmosphere to space and space to atmosphere. This is yet to be accurately measured or understood. The existence of plasma discharges from thunderstorms to space, called sprites, gnomes, and elves for their brief and ethereal appearance, is a relatively recent scientific discovery. Their genesis, power, and frequency is far from understood. While Thornhill discusses these phenomena in much more detail in his article, The Balloon Goes Up Over Lightning, which is on his HoloScience website. Cosmic rays enter the atmosphere, adding charge continuously. The rate Earth is exposed to solar wind fluctuates widely, both because the solar current fluctuates and so does the strength of the Earth's magnetic field. Sometimes the shield it provides moves around, letting more cosmic rays enter through holes. Electricity flows around Earth in Birkeland currents molded by the geomagnetic field. How these currents fluctuate in density and the resulting induced currents in the atmosphere and ground is another area of scientific uncertainty. Because of the variability, variety, and the fact they haven't noticed until recently, consensus science can't yet understand how much current is entering or leaving Earth's atmospheric system from space. The ground also carries potential that varies. Except for the monochrome view of seismic returns, we can't even see what is below the Earth's crust to comprehend the flow of the current there, nor whether, how, or where Earth's current might enter the atmosphere. For electricity, boundary layers like the Earth's crust isn't an impermeable barrier. It's an electrode. There is a cavity defined by the surface of the Earth and the inner edge of the ionosphere. It's been calculated that at any moment, the total charge residing in this cavity is 500,000 coulombs. Electromagnetic waves reflect from the boundary of the cavity, the ground, and the ionosphere, and establish quasi-standing electromagnetic waves at resonant frequencies. W.O. Schumann predicted the resonant properties of the cavity in 1952, and they were first detected in 1954. They are called Schumann's resonances and are measured as broadband electromagnetic impulses at frequencies in the range of 5 to 50 hertz. The atmosphere is undeniably electric. It's not a few ions benignly floating around in the air, occasionally forming into pools of charge, but a globally active and coherent circuit. What should that tell us about lightning? Mustn't it also be part of this coherent resonant system? Doesn't it beg for a better model than marbles in a drain pipe? Fortunately, there is a model to look at. It's called electronics. Atmospheric arcs created in a circuit are generally recognized to occur by thermionic emission. Everyone has seen a hot cathode arcing, like in a welding arc, where electrons are freed from the metal surface of the electrode by heat. The metal is heated by its own resistance to current and begins emitting electrons above a certain temperature, threshold specific to the electrode material. The temperature for many materials is thousands of degrees. Another form of discharge, less well recognized, is field emission or cold cathode emissions. They do not generate electrons by thermionic emission. The electrode warms, but not appreciably because heat is not what frees the electrons. It's the electric field strength, a high voltage potential that strips electrons from whatever material is present, including the air itself. When this happens, the field forms ionic matter into a plasma structure called a corona. Corona is the electron in the sky that discharges lightning. Coronal discharge is used in a variety of ways in modern technology. It requires a high voltage, which is precisely what is present in a thunderstorm, 300 million volts, or 1,000 times stronger than in clear weather. Corona is the only electrical phenomenon that can result in a non-thermal ionic discharge under atmospheric conditions. It's the driving force of the storm and the generator of lightning. Corona occurs in a layer perpendicular to the electric field where the field strips electrons from atoms, sending them downward at near the speed of light along the field gradient to collide inevitably with another atom. The collision strips more electrons free to follow the electric field, leaving ions behind. The region where electrons are stripped is a cold partial plasma. Increasing charge density by stripping and collision amplifies and shapes the electric field, which self-organizes into a corona. The pools of charge layered in the atmosphere are not pools of positive and negative charges depicted, but coronas that exhibit positive or negative polarity, composed of some mixture of ions and neutral species electrically interacting. Free electrons continue the process of collision in what's called an avalanche. Avalanche is portrayed in the step-leader process depicted in the image and is a witness precursor to a lightning bolt. The avalanche is one half of the picture, however. Lightning comes from below as much as from above. The electric field also pools positive ions on the ground below the storm. Ionic streamers, filaments of positively charged air, stretch up the electric field toward the clouds. A lightning bolt occurs when the cascading step leader and streamer meet, completing a plasma channel. None of this is seen with the naked eye. It's all dark current up to this point. The lightning channel is complete when it connects to a ground streamer. The connection allows a dump of electrons from the corona to ground, then heavier and significantly slower ions carry up the channel in a return stroke. The return stroke can be seen in the image as the bright flash that occurs the moment the first tendril of the avalanche current strikes Earth, leaving only one path glowing after the flash. Corona provides the reservoir of charge and the dark current mechanism for avalanche required to make an arc. This is what is missing in the consensus notions. The other consensus notion that static charge builds from hailstone collisions is also inadequate. A study using interferometer and Doppler radar to correlate lightning with updraft and downdraft winds showed that lightning forms in low-pressure winds around the storm cell updraft of warm, moist air. As a storm organizes and the updraft speeds up, lightning frequency dramatically intensifies. Updraft winds don't produce much lightning until they reach 10 to 20 miles an hour, the study found. Then strike frequency escalates with updraft speed. From 20 to 50 miles per hour wind speeds, lightning frequency might be 5 to 20 strikes per minute, whereas above 90 miles per hour, the flash rate can exceed 1 strike per second. It's like a motor running, and the central updraft is the primary mover. Water in a thunderstorm updraft goes through all of its phases, from water vapor to cloud condensate to rain, droplet to ice. The structure of a thunderstorm is oriented vertically around a central updraft. The phase changes stratify charge at temperatures where the transitions create ionization events. Water is self-ionizing. Water in its liquid state undergoes autoionization when two water molecules form one hydroxide anion and one hydronium cation. Water can further be ionized by impurities such as carbon dioxide to form carbonic acid. Water condensing into clouds and droplets within a strong electric field provides an ionization event. Water can become supersaturated, rising above 100% relative humidity if air is rapidly cooled, for example, by rising suddenly in an updraft. A supersaturation instability provides another opportunity for ionization. Ice is typically a positive charge carrier, meaning that current flows over its surface in streams of positive ions. Flash freezing water onto ice as hailstones grow provides another opportunity for ionization. Each layer of air in a storm has different temperature, humidity, pressure, and velocity, transporting different phases of water at different partial pressures, which means the conductivity of the air is changing too. This last item is important to remember. More about how this creates coronas requires a broader look at the circuitry of a supercell thunderstorm, which you will find interesting because it will show how coronas produce other effects. Perhaps it even explains all the effects of a thunderstorm. The electrical circuitry of a supercell will be continued in the next companion article on Earth's electrical weather. Over the series of articles we'll present, corona and its role in our weather will lead back to geology and previously presented discussions of arc blast and how mountains are built. Like all things electric, fractal forms repeat, such that a coherent picture emerges. And boy, have we got a picture for you. Thank you.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
Yeah, that was the Thunderbolts project there with, what's it called? Nature's Electrode. That's what the title of that one is. Definitely well worth visiting all of these videos, the graphics that accompany the spoken piece is hugely informative. The dialogue can tend to be very dry, and I do apologise if it's slightly off-putting for the less technical listener. Okay, well, I suppose it falls upon me to explain ionisation, because we're hearing a lot said about ions and electrons, cations and anions in all of these pieces. Right, I'll give it a go. Again, there appears to be some confusion between the physicists' model of the atom and the chemists' model of the atom. And being that chemistry is real world and physics tends to be more theoretical and experimental, I tend to refer more to the chemists' model of the atom. I suspect that the physicists are possibly more or less right with their model as well, and it may well be the number of possible direct electrical interactions that define chemistry are limited when it comes to the number of electrons in an electron ring, in an electron shell, and how those electrons can interact with the presence or absence of electrons in the shells of neighbouring atoms. And this is basically the principle of chemistry. So, to try and explain, we have a model of the atom with a central nucleus made up of neutrally charged neutrons and positively charged protons. In an electrically neutral atom, and most atoms are electrically neutral in their natural state, the amount of positive charge in the nucleus is exactly matched by the amount of negative charge in the surrounding cloud of electrons. In the case of helium, we have one proton and one electron, an incredibly simple atom. Under most circumstances, simple atoms do not readily react with other atoms, and they don't readily carry electrical charges. Generally speaking, the conductive elements tend to be much heavier atoms, and in physical terms, heavy isn't a property of weight as such. It's a matter of charge density, the number of protons and the number of electrons and the number of neutrons contained within the indivisible atom. Now, when we excite atoms through vibration, effectively, through agitation, this is what's commonly known as heat, the electron cloud becomes excited, becomes more energetic through the interaction, the motion, the bumping into of other atoms. And it's this kind of expanding electron shell that is responsible for the creation of plasmas. And essentially, once any atom goes beyond a certain level of excitation, once it goes above a certain temperature, once it goes above a certain electrical charge, let's say the atoms sat in between two electrically charged plates, that we can charge those two plates and that atom is going to stay unionized. It will become more and more excited, and eventually, once we reach a threshold energy, the electrons will become so excited that they are so loosely bound. Let's describe it gravitationally. It's easiest to conceive of these things like satellites rotating around a gravitationally bound object, that the rotational speed is centripetal force, and the gravitational attraction towards the center is a centrifugal force. And with the atom, we have the attraction of the negative charge of the electron being attracted to the proton in the center and desperately being inexorably pulled inwards. But at the same time, the speed of the electron around the atom is such that the speed is constantly trying to force the electron to fly off. And the electron exists in the sort of neutral balance between this attractive and repulsive forces. And so in a plasma, we're effectively looking at a situation where an element has been heated to such a degree or excited to such a degree by an electric field that it begins to shrug off electrons. And this is the process of ionization. When a neutrally charged atom, this is basically an atom that has neither positive or negative charge in respect to the surrounding atoms, that if we knock off an electron, now what we have is a positively charged atom and a free electron. And this is the process of ionization. And in this state, we have the free electrons, which are the negative part of the ionization, and we have the now more positively charged atoms, which have been altered from their charged neutral state to a charged positive state by the shrugging off of one or more of their electrons in their outer rings. As was described, I think, in that piece, plasma can be described as any more than 1% of any given body of gas or whatever, where the electrons have been knocked off of more than 1% of all of the atoms. So it can be 99% charged neutral, but with 1% of the atoms within that body of whatever having lost at least one electron and having gained a positive ionization. Now, while the electrons are still kind of hovering around within the plasma, while there's no current flowing, then the overall situation is still charged neutral. The amount of positive charge and the amount of negative charge within that substance is still going to be the same overall as it was before the event. However, if we increase the energetic agitation of those atoms a little further, then now we get to the point where the heavy anions, the heavy positive ions, want to stay where they're put, and the negative electrons no longer being associated with a heavy atom and no longer gravitationally bound, charge bound to their atom of origin, are now free to migrate, because essentially an electron is more or less massless on its own, are now free to migrate towards any available positive attractor. So in the case of something like lightning, the ionization happening in the clouds will mean that the ionized atoms of water with their electron missing and now positively charged will be repelled by the positive charge of the surface of the planet and will move up in the cloud body, creating this updraft. And at the same time, the electrons and any associated charge will be drawn to the bottom of the cloud. And when this charge at the bottom of the cloud breaches this 300 million volts, I think I'm quoting that right, could be wrong, 300 million volts that is needed to breach the capacitive resistance of the air, then we get this cascade of electrons, this drain pipe of electrons that pours all of that charge suddenly from the cloud down to Earth. And in fact, the process of lightning is there's normally each lightning strike consists of up to about 50 almost simultaneous strikes. Strike and return is actually what happens, where the electron flow is so excessive and is so instantaneous that the local region of the Earth will not be able to dissipate that energy quickly enough and will become negatively charged. And because of the massive outrushing of electrons from the cloud, the base of the cloud will now become locally positively charged. And so you see an uprush of those electrons back up into the cloud. And in fact, each lightning bolt is a succession of these up and down yo-yos, but happening in such a split second that until we had the sort of high-speed modern photography, it was impossible to see. Anyway, so there's kind of a rough sort of outlining of what we're talking about when we're talking about a plasma. We're talking about a situation where atoms become liberated, or where electrons become liberated of their atoms of source, and with that liberation, and because of their much lower charge density, mass, whichever way you want to look at it, those electrons are able to move more freely through any medium. And so we can see the process of charge accumulation both on the surface of the planet and in the atmosphere, and especially in the clouds, in the sort of water-bearing parts of the atmosphere, and how these charges can separate out easily into very polarized positive and negative charges within the same cloud. So the top of the cloud will become extremely positively charged and the bottom of the cloud will become extremely negatively charged, and that negative charge will actually draw the positive charge of the surrounding ground, of the surrounding planet, into essentially dislike charges attract. And when the circumstances of those charge attractions exceeds the overall resistance of the air, then we see stuff like lightning. The point that I'm trying to make here is that lightning is the manifestation of those charges. The actual charges themselves were there all along and completely invisible. And we live in this kind of charged plasma where there are always this kind of primarily neutral soup of cations, anions, free electrons, and moving charges, just simply not anything like so dramatic as what we see with lightning. Anyway, I'm going to fly on. Already coming up to pretty much on the hour. I'm going to bash out another quick Thunderbolts project pod. This one is the electric model, and I'll be back after a tune after that. So you have a chance for a wee break. Okay, back soon.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. The most violent type of weather storm on planet Earth is a tornado. Meteorologists tell us that the unstable air in a thunderstorm produces updrafts and downdrafts, which interacts with the wind shear to ultimately create a tornado vortex. But many scientists acknowledge that the exact processes that cause a tornado remain mysterious. In recent Space News episodes, Thunderbolts contributor Andrew Hall has explored the electrical genesis of lightning and other earthly weather phenomena. Today, Hall offers his own thesis on the electrical genesis of tornadoes on Earth.
Previously, in Nature's Electrode, we looked at an electric Earth model for lightning genesis driven by a plasma corona formed from condensing and freezing water vapor in the central updraft of a thunderhead. We also looked at the thunderstorm itself and an electric model for the circuit that drives it in the summer thermopile. Now let's consider the most dramatic weather event of all, the tornado, and how these massively destructive whirlwinds are also formed by a plasma corona in a thunderstorm. For air to become plasma and carry current, the air has to be partially ionized. A plasma state can be defined by plasma density, the number of free electrons per unit volume, and the degree of ionization, the proportion of atoms ionized by loss or gain of an electron. A gas with as little as 1% of the particles ionized is a plasma, responding to magnetic fields and displaying high electrical conductivity. A partially ionized plasma is often referred to as a cold plasma, and highly ionized plasma is referred to as hot. Discharge from a corona is predominantly a cold, dark current, invisible to the eye. Cloud-to-ground arcs from high charge density regions of the corona surrounding the central updraft where current from the updraft generates ions. Ground charge builds below this region in response, and the electric field strengthens, magnifying and focusing electron avalanche the way a lens focuses light into a continuous plasma channel. When the channel connects with ground and discharges a hot current, it wraps tightly in its own magnetic field, in what is called a Z-pinch. But moving away from this self-ionizing high electromagnetic field region of the corona, free electrons spit at the ground, but lack the energy and focus to avalanche all the way, creating instead a mobile cloud of ionized gas that follows the field gradient to ground, generating a dark current. The current is said to drift in this region, yet the electric field still organizes the drifting ions into a columnar channel. In this image, the center of the coronal discharge is focused and imparts more energy to the cascading electrons, creating the potential for lightning arcs. See the current density distribution at the bottom of the diagram. Closer to the outer edge of the corona, weaker reactions manifest in transfer of momentum and heat with ions and neutral matter. Downdraft and downburst winds are the common result. Momentum transfer manifests as downdraft winds by the process of electrokinesis, which is neutral species attracted to and mobilized by the charged particles zooming down the electric field gradient toward the ground, creating an electric wind that moves the bulk fluid along the electric field gradient. If the ionization rate exceeds the rate of recombination, the plasma will build a streamer, a tendril of plasma from cloud to earth, pushing a plasma-generating ionization region ahead of it, and drawing behind it a cloud of cold plasma. When this plasma hits ground, a cathode spot is produced, and the electromagnetic field redistributes along the plasma channel, focusing it. The cathode spot on the ground draws positive charge to it, dragging neutrals, again by electrokinesis, and creating the inflowing winds that generate a ground vortex. This is the moment of tornado touchdown, as charged air and dust flow in and spiral upwards around the invisible plasma tendril. The action is analogous to the lightning bolt leader and positive ground streamer that meet to create a channel for lightning discharge. Two seemingly separate events organized into one coherent structure by the electric field. The plasma current thus created is a complete circuit to ground, only it's partially ionized, diffused with predominantly neutral species. Its energy and charge densities are too low to make an arc, so it forms a complex plasma channel called a Markland convection. Rotation is a natural consequence of the circuit. Neutral air is diffused away from the Markland current, creating low pressure. But positive ions near the ground drag air, dust, and debris to the ground contact and create inflowing winds and a sudden change in direction up and around the tendril. The meeting of these opposing winds is the ground vortex. The current flow in the plasma will itself rotate, taking a helical path as it interacts with the magnetic field around it. The appearance of a tornado is precisely the expected morphology of a Markland current. Increasing current flow will spin up the tornado. It forms an inner spiraling negative current to ground and an outer spiral of positive ionic wind flowing up to the source of coronal discharge in the cloud. Because the tornado is a cold partial plasma current exchanging charge between ground and atmosphere, it can be pushed by winds to create a slanted or kinked path and travel away from its point of origin. There are several telltale signs the electric model of tornado genesis is correct. One evidence is wall clouds. Wall clouds form before a tornado in a typical storm evolution. It develops rotation, and sometimes its clouds can be seen to rise and fall in an agitated manner. Puffs of low-level clouds are drawn to it below the main cloud base. The wall cloud is a physical expression of the corona. As the corona gathers charge, it creates a lowering, vertical wall of cloud as ionization condenses moisture in the column of air below that is incongruous to the general slant in motion of the storm clouds and inflowing winds. It's visual evidence of a region where the electric field is strengthening and the corona is increasing charge density prior to establishing a current to ground with a tornado. The funnel cloud doesn't always emerge from the center of the wall cloud. The funnel often appears along the edges of the wall cloud or from the surrounding clouds. This is because the region of charge density is mobile and can wander. They can also multiply, creating several tornadoes. Characteristic of parallel currents, multiple tornadoes stand off from each other as if repulsed like two parallel wires flowing current in the same direction. Rare occasions when tornadoes seem to merge, it may be that one simply dies as the other steals its current. The sudden disappearance and reappearance of tornadoes, and the reported skipping or lifting they seem to portray, are likely caused by pulsating current from an unstable coronal discharge that weakens until recombination steals the current, and then revives when the rate of ionization again overcomes the rate of recombination and a complete circuit to ground is reestablished. As discussed in Nature's Electrode and This Summer Thermopile, lightning frequency is highest around the central updraft and increases in frequency with the strength of the updraft wind. When a tornado forms, cloud-to-ground lightning frequency diminishes until the tornado dies, and then picks up again to the previous baseline. It's also found that positive lightning is more common in tornadic storms. The latter is evidence the corona in the storm's anvil that spits positive lightning is instrumental in creating the electric field strength necessary for a tornado. It amplifies the field strength affecting the negative corona in the cloud base below, creating conditions necessary for tornadoes. The fact that cloud-to-ground lightning dissipates as a tornado spins up is evidence the corona is part of a coherent electric circuit, where current in one region robs current from another. Storms that produce tornadoes are often characterized by a greenish tint in the clouds. The green tint is excused by scientists as a reflection of city lights. While their search for green-tinted city lights continues, the dim glow of a coronal discharge internal to the cloud formation explains the green tint. Luminosity in the clouds and the funnel are also reported. Consensus science blames this on misidentified sources of light, from lightning, city lights, or flashes from ground power lines. Some of it, no doubt, is, but some of it is likely the effect of coronal discharge. Lightning flashes don't make a continuous glow. Ionized oxygen can recombine to produce ozone, which has a distinctive chlorine-like gassy smell. This smell is often reported by witnesses. So are hissing sounds from the base of the funnel. Funnel clouds and small tornadoes are known to produce harmonic sounds of whistling, whining, humming, or buzzing bees. As ozone is liberated, it produces such a hissing sound. Energized transmission lines, subject to overvoltage conditions, produce all of these same effects: faint luminescent glow, ozone production, and its accompanying hiss and smell. The cause is coronal discharge. Tornadoes also produce identifiable infrasound. It's inaudible to the human ear, but it can be felt. It will produce nausea, agitation, and body heat, effects often felt in the presence of tornadoes, although fear might do that too. Lightning has been reported internal to the funnel, and these may be a form of cloud-to-cloud discharge between the counterflowing positive and negative currents in the Markland convection. Tornadoes are seen to have an inner and outer column, although this is disputed by consensus scientists as an illusion. The inner column, however, is seen if the outer dusty sheath dissipates or is blown away. It is consistent with the double wall formation in a Markland convection. Tornadoes emit on the electromagnetic spectrum as measured by researchers. Tornadoes emit spherics, which is the same type of broadband radio noise lightning discharges produce. So what if there is no supercell? How do all other vortex phenomena form, like land spouts and water spouts, gustnadoes and dust devils? And how are they related? Well, by the same mechanism proposed here for the supercell tornado, only in lower energy form. Funnel clouds, which never result in a touchdown, are a tendril of Markland convection current that begins to recombine faster than it generates ions, and it dies. Land spouts, gustnadoes, and water spouts all begin with a surface disturbance, a vortex without a cloud, or at least not one showing a wall cloud or rotation. These are instances of stronger ionic accumulation at ground level, creating a strong ground vortex first in easily ionized sand or water, whereas the corona above is still weak and diffuse. This comports with observations of twisters of all kinds, including dust devils and spouts, which are seen to begin on the ground, or water in the case of a water spout, where documented evolution begins with a mysterious dark spot on the water. Thunderstorms, lightning, and tornadoes, all products of the same weather event, can be perfectly modeled electrically. Electromagnetic fields, ionization, current, capacitance, and induction rule nature. It is evident in nature's every aspect because the fractal self-same patterns always appear. Consensus science adheres to a gravity model that ignores this fundamental causation and instead feverishly dissects the emergent thermodynamic and fluid dynamic interactions looking for answers, like trying to tell time by taking apart the clock. They continually come up short as a result. Thank you.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
wisdom. The children dance as the moonlight kissed them.
To massive attack, Matt Black appear wearing beats. 2 hours traveling, so I wrote this on repeat. Boys living fast, people getting jumpy. Where arguably falls, I just do the water pumping. Microphones so close, crowds so far apart. Take my piece of money, so my name across your heart.
Blue lines there, massive attack. Massive. Awesome. A bit quiet there. Possibly just muttering. Yeah. Welcome back to the second half of the 25th voyage of the Psychonautilus. Well, it would appear, from the fact that the chat box hasn't entirely evacuated during the course of the show, that you must be kind of getting something out of this. It's always very difficult to know exactly where to peg this, where people's academic and intellectual limits fall on subjects like this. But I'm about to go into electrogravitics, which is something that I was already toying with to some degree when I came across Wal Thornhill's. Let me just make sure I'm coming through there. Yeah, when I came across Wal Thornhill's work on his atomic dipole electrogravitic theory, and as pertinent as he is apt to be, our Mithrin, my fellow Essex kith and kin, asks in the chat, I was once in an earthquake tremor for about 3 to 5 seconds, but the sofa I was sitting on went up and down like the ocean, and the walls and wooden beams rippled like rubber. My question is, does something happen to materials, the materials' electromagnetic bonds, perhaps? Well, specifically within seismology, what you're describing there sounds like the P wave and S wave effect, where you have a linear and a transverse wave emanating from the source of the earthquake. One of these is an up and down action, and the other one is a backwards and forwards action. The wooden beams are not simply kind of tearing themselves apart and collapsing, rather than rippling, as you describe. While I don't doubt for one moment that you saw something like that, it may be that the subsonic frequencies, that the infrasound being released by the earthquake, may have been having some effect on the optics of your eyes. I've certainly experienced that at an incredible rave one time, where the bass was so immensely powerful that it was literally changing the shape of my eyeballs, and so the entire room would change shape and size every time the bass line kicked. I should imagine with something like infrasound, that's even more possible. Infrasound being frequencies below the audible, sort of 5 hertz or 10 hertz or whatever, 20 hertz actually, 20 cycles a second is sort of common, lowest human hearing. However, it kind of dials into the work of Judy Woods on 9/11, and also some extraordinary reports and video footage of flying objects during tornadoes that appear to acquire trajectories and vectors that have nothing to do with the cycling of the air. Particularly, there's been a couple of clips of lorries being hurled in hurricanes, but they're often picked up at the margin of the storm eye, and the trajectory that they're launched into and the forces involved are simply not correspondent with those which would be known to be existing due to the action of wind alone within the hurricane column. And so it has been theorized by some in this field, looking at this field, that what we're actually seeing there is such a massive electrostatic impact on the normal electrostatic environment, which through Wall Thornhill's work on electrogravity suggests that gravity is an electrical effect. And so if enough opposite charge is placed into any given region, the force of gravity could be partially or completely cancelled, or even potentially completely reversed. And one of the reasons why I refer to Judy Wood in this is because of her work on the tumbling cars and the burning cars during the sort of events of 9/11. I don't actually hold with her space-based weapons. I've actually looked an awfully deeply into the Star Wars project and the technology that came out of that, most of which really didn't work. The only thing that we really got out of it that worked was multi-kilowatt laser, which was small enough that it could be fitted onto a jumbo jet. Now, fitting something onto a jumbo jet is very different to launching something into a geostationary orbit. And so I doubt very much if weaponry of this capacity has been created and been able to be launched into space. However, we do have the public data on the capabilities of HARP, and I would suggest that the location of HARP and the behaviour of the hurricane, can't remember the name of it, that was heading towards New York on that day, would certainly imply that some sort of electromagnetic effect was being deployed. And if one goes into the sort of extreme ends of sort of Tesla's work into resonance, into the potential possibilities of something like Wall Thornhill's electrogravitic model, that effectively if we could localize an ionizing field counter to that of the field that creates gravity in a building, and either pulse this, or more likely to send it as a sinusoidal, as an alternating wave of positivity and negativity, it is conceivable that simply by literally, sorry, I got a cat dancing at the window. Let me let this bloody cat in. Come on, you're dormant now, Mike. It's not the kids. The kids are all away. Oi, cat, you want to come in? Oi, Pog. Oh, you cow. Right, I'll leave the window open. You can let yourself bloody in. Where was I? Yeah, but effectively by repeatedly sort of lifting by a tiny amount and then lowering by a tiny amount a structure as heavy as the World Trade Center, one could conceivably pulverize it to the extent that we witnessed on that day, with nothing more than just the right frequency of just the right energy of just the right ionizing field to affect bearing in mind, of course, that the World Trade Center, as we know, was a steel-framed building made up primarily of steel, which would turn it into a fantastic antenna if nothing else, to be picking up radio frequencies. So yes, I suppose it is possible that things like the sofa appearing to rise inordinately into the air during that event, Mithrin, that yes, that could well have been an electrogravitic event. However, I would suggest that the kind of appearance of everything rippling was more likely to be an optical effect of infrasound. But that's a real kind of flinging it out there, giving it my best shot. I'm actually going to go with another Thunderbolts because honestly, I can't do it as well as Wall, and I'm sorry about the previous two audios having been bordering on painfully dry in their delivery. I do wish that some of these academics could generate some of the enthusiasm for speaking about their subject that I can muster being a non-academic. But anywho, so this is Wal Thornhill. This is kind of really where I want to go after this. So it's easier to have him explain it. But Wal Thornhill, again, touching on a subject that, as far as I'm aware, the Thunderbolts project have not covered in any of their previous releases. Apparently it is covered on his site. It's very errant of me not to have found that and to have done my kind of base research. However, I did now some year and a half ago present my gravitic model for hollow planets, for hollow spherical planets. And not only does Wal explore his electrogravitics in this, but he also explains how those electrogravitics imply that all spherical objects in space must be hollow. You can't end up with a solid sphere, regardless of which model you use to explain gravity. Just to explain this, essentially it's said that if you were to dig a hole from one side of the Earth to the other side of the Earth and jump down it, you would accelerate for the first half of the journey due to the attraction of gravity. Once you got past a certain point, now there's so much mass above you that it's beginning to attract you and to decelerate you in the same way that the mass below your feet is attracting you and trying to accelerate you. By the time you pass the halfway mark in the Earth's core, should you be able to survive such a thing, now that process of deceleration becomes more than 50%. So there's no more acceleration. There's only the deceleration is decreasing. The acceleration is decreasing and the deceleration is increasing. And it suggested that you would be able to pop out of the hole on the other side of the planet, having accelerated to free fall speed during the fall, and arrive at the surface on the other side with exactly the same amount of effort that you put to jumping down the hole in the first place. So effectively you would be able to simply step out of the hole on the other side, having decelerated back to stationary by the time that you get there. Obviously, air resistance provided. And so because of this, we have this null zone in the middle of planets where effectively gravity is up in all directions. There's a zero gravity region within the middle of any spherical gravitationally bound object, which would mean that all of the material within that zone will not be being attracted to the center like gravity is normally conceived of as working. It will be being attracted to the center of mass, or to the proportionately nearer center of mass, in which case outwards in all directions. And so in exactly the same way that the forces of gravity act on the surface of the sphere inwards to maintain the structure of the planet, there will be an equal and opposite force acting outwards from the inside, and it's inconceivable of any way that a planet could actually form as a solid sphere. It has to form hollow. With Wal Thornhill's electrogravitic model, this becomes even easier to explain and to visualize. So here's a bit more Thunderbolts Project, Wal Thornhill, and this is what's inside Jupiter. Nothing. It's a hollow sphere.
Welcome to Space News from the Electric Universe, brought to you by the Thunderbolts Project at thunderbolts.info. In part 1 of this presentation, physicist Wal Thornhill began his analysis of the extraordinary revelations from NASA's Juno mission to the gas giant Jupiter. Like every other recent space mission, what scientists are finding is not what they expected. In the previous episode, Thornhill focused on Jupiter's remarkable electrified atmosphere, an environment that astonished astronomers in 1994 when it was, quote, probed by the natural intruder, the comet Shoemaker-Levy 9. Today, Thornhill will explore the internal composition and dynamics of the gas giant, already a source of major surprise for NASA investigators. Consensus scientific theory states that Jupiter's incredibly powerful magnetic field is powered by a mysterious internal dynamo. But nothing that the Juno mission has discovered supports this hypothesis. As principal investigator Scott Bolton stated, "I didn't expect all the theories to be wrong, but there's motion going on in the planet we did not anticipate. How did Jupiter form, and what is it composed of down to its core?" Wal Thornhill explains the differences between the theoretical predictions of the electric universe and those of standard astronomical theory.
In my first space news about the first science from Juno at Jupiter, I looked at Jupiter's atmosphere, comparing Juno's findings with the earlier Shoemaker-Levy 9 comet fragments encounter with the giant planet. In this second part, I looked deeper inside Jupiter and showed just how different Jupiter looks in the electric universe model compared to the children's tale we have been taught. The comparison is quite confronting. Returning to the teleconference, Scott Bolton, Juno principal investigator, showed a diagram of what Jupiter's interior might look like. It represents what most scientists believed before Juno got there. Scott said, and I paraphrase a little, "We have 3 different techniques to look into Jupiter. One is the gravity field, which sees all the way down to the bottom, where you see an ice rock core and you're looking at 40 million times the atmospheric pressure at sea level on Earth. We have a magnetic field experiment that looks into that bluish region that's called metallic hydrogen, and that's where the hydrogen is squeezed so much and the temperature is such that it's like a liquid metallic hydrogen, and we believe somewhere in there, maybe the magnetic field gets created, or maybe above that where there's enough charged particles. But the magnetic field penetrates into that. The upper meteorological layer is the atmosphere, which is actually quite deep. We've never seen that before Juno's microwave radiometer, so we have these 3 ways to look into Jupiter. The top part is done with the microwaves, the middle part is done with the magnetic field, and then the gravity looks all the way down to the centre. The electric universe model doesn't accept the story of how Jupiter was formed, and it questions 2 of the 3 ways used to look inside Jupiter. To put it bluntly, settled science doesn't understand how stars and planets are formed and has no explanation for the origin of magnetism or gravity. So everything below Jupiter's atmosphere will be misinterpreted. The electric universe has the outstanding and crucial advantage of a real physical model of magnetism and gravity. It's based on a repeated pattern of the orbiting electrical structure of atoms, applied to the subatomic particles within each atom. It's a simple electrical model that could be taught in primary school and demonstrated with magnets. So let's look at gravity. It will be difficult for those who think settled science has explained gravity to unlearn the misleading model of a rubber sheet warped by heavy objects placed upon it. The rubber sheet is a fanciful 2-dimensional representation of 3-dimensional space. Nothing physically exists in 2 dimensions. Yet the Sun and Earth are shown in 3 dimensions as spheres. They should be shown as circles on the sheet, but that would destroy the illusion. Unrealistic geometry can never explain gravity. Conceptually, the rubber sheet would be flat unless gravity was exerting a force downward on objects from underneath the sheet. That's using gravity to explain gravity. But the silliest feature of Einstein's theory is that his gravity is not a force at all. Objects placed on the rubber sheet have no reason to move anywhere. Think about it. So how does the electric universe explain gravity? Uncommon sense suggests the origin of gravity is to be found in the particles that make up a celestial body. So the electric universe proposes both the proton and the electron have internal structure like the atom, and are composed of smaller charged particles in orbit. The proton and electron are like tiny atoms, but with a net charge, positive and negative respectively. And like atoms, the protons and electrons will distort in an electric field and align with their neighbours like tiny magnets to form daisy-chained electric dipoles. That's the origin of gravity inside a weighty body. It explains the puzzling extreme weakness of gravity, since it originates almost entirely in the heavy atomic nuclei, which are electrically shielded inside atoms. This model also explains the origin of the much stronger magnetic force, where the electron or proton is free to be accelerated in an unshielded electric field. The consequences of the electric universe model of electrogravity are profound for Jupiter and may explain the unexpected results from Juno. As we know, gravity can't be shielded, so the heavy positively charged nucleus in each atom is displaced radially towards the centre of Jupiter. This means that atoms to some depth in Jupiter will have a positive electric pole facing the centre of the planet and a negative electric pole facing outwards to the rest of the universe. Jupiter appears as a negative gravitational sphere to the rest of the universe. Gravity throughout the universe is a repulsive force. However, the Juno spacecraft is orbiting within Jupiter's gravitational sphere of influence and has an induced gravitational dipole, which attracts the spacecraft like an iron filing to a magnet. That's the effect we experience on Earth and call gravity. Scientists for centuries have assumed that they can simply extrapolate our experience of attraction to the Earth throughout the universe, despite the fact that galaxies don't move in support of this belief. So the inside of Jupiter is unlike anything ever contemplated by Newtonian physics. Jupiter's gravity is almost 2.5 times stronger than that of the Earth. So internally, at some depth, there will be a strong repulsive force due to the positive gravitational poles facing inwards, which can hold a spherical shell of matter stably in place. Jupiter is hollow and doesn't have a core of liquid metallic hydrogen. Of course, the same argument for hollowness holds for the Earth and all other celestial bodies, so it's significant that a number of leading scholars in the past have considered this possibility. Today, the subject is considered crackpot and taboo by settled science. But science generally advances through paradigm shifts initiated by individuals who are not subject to science's taboos, the small voice at the back of the crowd crying, "The emperors have no clothes." A recent independent feasibility study by a South African, Jan Lamprecht, into the seismology expected of a hollow Earth, found that it fits the detailed observations of seismology without all of the ad hoc assumptions and mysteries of the standard model of the Earth, involving Newton's law and an inner and outer core. Lamprecht asks, is there anything in seismology which could be a misinterpretation of a hollow cavity? The answer is yes. The Earth's outer core could easily be a cavity. He argues the Earth is cool and brittle deep down to a depth of 700 kilometres because many deep quakes have been recorded at that depth. In the standard Earth model, the rocks should be hot, dense and plastic beyond a depth of 150 kilometres and incapable of generating earthquakes. What no scientist on Earth is willing to accept is that maybe gravity doesn't work in the way they think it does, says Lamprecht. An even more compelling argument for a hollow Earth is that the inner surface has features more pronounced seismically than those at the surface. Of course, planetary scientists have an immediate objection to a hollow Earth because, based on its gravitational mass, the Earth theoretically must have a dense core. But this exposes another serious problem in basic physics, the confusion of mass, which is a property of matter, with the quantity of matter. Unbelievable as it may seem, physics has no definition of mass in terms of matter. And because both words begin with the letter M, does not make them mathematically equivalent, because we know from E equals mc squared that mass is an energetic variable, while the amount of matter remains fixed. Electrogravity involves a radial electric field in the Earth's matter, which is a form of stored energy, like a capacitor. Changing the electric charge on the Earth can change the Earth's mass and gravity. This has been shown by Earth's rotational glitches when hit by massive storms of charged particles from the Sun. It also means that it is impossible to figure out the composition of the Earth or Jupiter or any other celestial body by simply measuring its gravity and applying an invalid model of their interiors. Apollo 12 placed the first seismometer on another world. On the 20th of November 1969, the Apollo 12 lunar module was sent crashing into the Moon's surface to ensure some kind of seismic result, because it was thought the Moon should be seismically dead. The Moon's behaviour was totally unexpected. It rang like a bell for an hour. Scientists were stunned at the time. How often do we hear this? The trace shown here was recorded by the seismometers left behind on the surface. The simplest interpretation suggests the Moon is hollow. Of course, this was beyond belief, so the Earth model was applied and massaged to appear to accommodate this stunning failure of expectations. Since then, Apollo seismic observations discovered that the Moon is seismically active with more than 13,000 seismic events recorded. The most frequently observed are deep moonquakes at 800 to 1200 kilometres depth in the Moon. Though intensive studies have been carried out for decades, why and how deep moonquakes occur are remaining mysteries, says one expert. That sounds familiar.
For continuous updates on space news from the electric universe, stay tuned to thunderbolts.info.
Fabulous Wal Thornhill there. Just so admire that man. He doesn't declare any academic qualifications, so I really don't know whether he's a layman in sort of common terms, or whether he's simply an academic that chooses not to rely on numbers and letters after his name to imply some degree of understanding or wisdom. Hugely admire the man. In fact, I'm going to go back to the conversation I was having with Mithrin here in the chat. Where are we? Okay, so because this kind of casts quite a reasonable light on this. Okay, so Mithrin asks, so all the gravity is in the shell of the surface. Well, it's kind of, yes, you're right, that the only place that you would experience the force known as gravity would be in close proximity to this shell planet, that within the centre of the planet would be effectively zero gravity, and beyond the immediate sphere of influence, according to the inverse square law, the diminishing field effect over distance, that there will be a point out in space where, again, you arrive at effectively zero gravity. Let's call it gravity neutral. And we then go on to discuss the implications of this, that effectively, if the Earth is hollow, and should you be able to visit the interior of the planet, you would effectively be able to walk around on the inside of the surface with up out here. Again, Buckminster Fuller nailed this. And not from any approach around this subject at all. This was purely from geometric and architectural considerations. He would invite all of his students to reject the terms up and down, and instead replace them with the terms in and out. And certainly when you're starting to think of these kind of spherical models, up and down become meaningless. You're purely talking about in, as in towards the centre of something, or out away from the centre of something. And so if we think in terms of in and out, that on the inside of this hollow earth, if you were standing on the surface of the inside, as in with your feet facing outwards in context of us here on the surface, that you would actually be gravitationally attracted in that direction. So you would be essentially equally as gravitationally attracted to that piece of the Earth's crust on the inside from the other direction as you would be on the top. The only difference is that because you're now inside the hollow earth instead of sitting on the outside of it with all of it at your feet, you haven't got all of the earth at your feet, you've only got a proportion of the earth at your feet. The majority of the planet's mass attraction effect on you is going to be sideways, diagonally, and above your head. And so the effective gravity of somebody standing upside down, pointing with their feet pointing outwards on the inside of this hollow sphere would experience gravity at their feet the same as we do. However, the mass that was creating that gravity would be significantly less, and again subject to the inverse square law, the reducing, diminishing effect over distance, that all of the mass in all directions from them would be attracting them with an equal proportion to that at their feet. And so standing on the inside of the earth, you would experience a very different gravitational effect. And one would assume that if you could jump high enough into the air, high enough out into the air, whichever one it is, that you would reach some sort of a null point where instead of being brought back down in a tangential arc back down to the surface, that you would actually reach a much lower escape velocity from the inside and end up floating around in the null zone, no longer able to have your feet touch the ground. I don't think it's ever going to be possible to visit this inner Earth, should it exist, simply because if this is the case, the forces that we've experienced in trying to drill down into the Earth's crust so far, and their ever rising temperatures and pressures, one would assume that this crust would have to be of quite a significant thickness. And because of this effect of being squeezed from both sides, that this pressure and temperature could easily rise to moderately infinite kind of levels, you know what I mean? Infinite in inverted commas, you know what I mean? When numbers start getting that large, then they effectively become as close to infinity as makes no sort of meaningful difference. So I hope that in my exploration of what ionisation is, how we experience it. Oh, hold on. What's this? Question. If you lived on the inside, is there a light source? If so, would you cast a shadow in all directions? Okay, go on then. I'll just touch on this one. This so far hasn't been planetary formation. Planetary formation, as far as I'm aware, has yet to be covered by Thunderbolts Project. So expect it to be arriving on YouTube sometime in about 2 months, now that I'm about to cover it. What I suspect is that planets are effectively suns, but that they are suns of a lower order. Whereas a sun's energetic state is such that it's able to shrug off all of its material products, that the lower order suns that must inevitably occupy the interior of planets will be incapable of entirely shrugging off their the material overcoats. Oh God, my throat's just completely closed up on me. Excuse me. I'm gonna have to put on a tune, clear my lungs, and take off some clothing. As daft as that sounds. And we're back in the room. Do accept my apologies on that, folks. I am actually pretty much a chronic asthmatic. I certainly don't recommend it as a self-medication, but I actually treat my asthma with vast amounts of cannabis and finely shredded Virginian tobacco, as per Culpeper's Herbalists of 15 something or other. Yeah, sorry, I foolishly overheated. My asthma is brought on by kind of excessive body temperature, and I'd forgot to take my sweatshirt off when I came back in from the shop earlier, and I was sitting here and slowly cooking, and threshold temperature was breached. Throat shut up. No more speaky. Anyway, to plough on. Where was I? I have completely lost my thread now. Let me just pull up where we kind of were in the chat. Oh yeah, we were talking about a light source. Yeah, so in my model, planets are lower order suns. That they are effectively these Birkeland currents, these positive and negative channels twisting in the vacuum of space, and that in a massive extension to anything that the Thunderbolts have touched on. It's my suggestion that these extremities of electrical force being focused through various sort of toroidal, tidal forces within the ether are the actual source of the atoms, the stuff of reality, and that these atoms are blown off of the surface of this electric arc, this plasma core of whatever the object is, and according to the amount of current that this plasma object is able to liberate depends on whether those are helium and hydrogen atoms, or in the case of this planet, mostly iron and aluminium and metal, silicate. And in the case of the likes of Jupiter, we have the gas giants, where they appear to be producing primarily gases. And one thing that Wal Thornhill references in that previous piece about Jupiter is he talks about Jupiter being cathodic, being electrically negative, which I've never heard him or anybody else within the electric universe theory discuss before, and he doesn't explore it in that piece. But my suspicion is that he's also onto this planetary formation model, and that this could be in a similar way to the acid and alkaline loving plants deploying opposite electrically exploitative strategies in their biology, that in the anatomy of a planet, its electropositivity or electronegativity may be the thing that defines whether it becomes a hard, solid planet or a large, gassy one, as in the case of the likes of Jupiter. This does kind of fly against my all planets are positive Hence, no such thing as interplanetary collision as per the sort of standard SI model. Okay, look, I've been hammering at this for most part of 2 hours now with the odd music break and that. I mean, I've got so much more to say on this subject that it really could do with the second visit. So really, in summation, I hope that you can take away from this evening's broadcast a vision. And this is the thing for me. When I developed my electrobiology hypothesis, for me it was like having new eyes for the world. I walked through the world as a child once more, and everything was filled with an immense sense of functionality and importance and relevance. And still now, I can't look at a plant without looking at it in an effort to interpret the shape of the field that created that plant, and the reflection that this has on my electrobiology theory is that certainly in the terms of plants, Mithrin was asking me to explore the zoobiology and geology side of this. I'm afraid I simply haven't been able to make head or tail of those enough yet. However, I suspect that the same rules will apply. That in effect, a plant appears to be a biological exploitation of an existing standing spike on the background electromagnetic cold plasma field, and that having germinated and having begun to exploit that, it introduces its own electromagnetic effect into that existing field. And so not only is it exploiting the field, but it is also doing everything within its power to enhance the exploitation of that field, i.e. increasing the strength of that field locally. And so it is possible to conceive of the morphology of the shapes of plants as being a coalition of atoms, of elements along electromagnetic polarization lines. And so a plant could be described as a frozen freestanding plasma field, and that all of its parts, the atoms that go to make up its parts, have arrived at those places in space, those places within the three-dimensional structure, purely because of the nature of that particular atom and the way that particular ion or whatever interacts with the already existing shape. If you want to kind of explore that subject a little bit more, I would invite you to go and look for why it is that snowflakes are the shape that they are, because it's a really interesting little sort of mini fact. Maybe I'll visit that one next week. I don't know where the hell I'm going to be going next week. Sometime in the future, I may explore the thermodynamic properties of a snowflake in this respect. Okay, that's probably kind of, the best summation that I can give you is just to go out into the world with this in mind and look at the objects around you, not as if they are some random collection of stuff that just through some mysterious divine being have found themselves occupying the space and the shapes that they occupy. That this appears to be a fundamental electric interaction between things and the property of the environment, the properties of the environment that those things occupy. And it might, this could answer all of our problems. This could answer our energy needs. This could answer our plant production, our food production needs, our health needs, a fuller understanding of this electromagnetic environment in which we all exist as these sort of charged neutral objects in the interspace. It has enormous potential for the future. One thing that I would caution against as the last word here is that I suggest that planetary motion, things like planetary rotation and atmospheric conditions are a result of this electromagnetic interplay. And I'm concerned that any efforts to draw down some of that energy for our use, some way of harnessing or harvesting atmospheric electrical potential, could potentially have very far-reaching consequences. That if that energy is no longer going into spinning the planet, it's possible that the planet may slow down on its rotation on its axis by a direct proportion of whatever energy we take out of that system, which it is that's spinning it currently. So again, I call for a greater effort to understand this situation. Anyway, spin up a few tunes till midnight, keep you all occupied. Thanks for listening. Hope your brains ain't too bent. This is the end of the voyage 25th of the Psychonautilus. Coming up, hope nobody ends up with the bends. Life jackets will be available for those who are still struggling.